Well, I know for a fact there are a lot of happy people in this room. Jerusalem, we wish you a very happy Hanukkah. And I think this one will go down as especially special.
Donald Trump celebrated his first Hanukkah in the White House one day after formally recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. His decision has long been the goal of two key groups of Trump supporters: evangelical Christians and conservative backers of Israel. The latter includes casino billionaire and GOP mega donor Sheldon Adelson. He donated more than $20 million during the campaign after candidate Trump vowed to move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. And Adelson had reportedly been frustrated that the move hadn't happened sooner. And joining me now is Frank Schaeffer, religious reform activist and author of Letter to Lucy. And thank you for being here, Frank. You know, in addition to Sheldon Adelson, there is this other part of the Trump base that is really excited about this move. And I want to read you something from Haaretz, which is the liberal paper, one of the more liberal publications in Israel. And they have this quote. It says, in order to truly understand the centrality of this theological dog whistle to Trump's evangelical base, you must take their religious beliefs seriously, argued progressive Christian commentator and pundit Dana Butler Bass in a widely circulated thread on Twitter. This is vital, she explained, because rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem would initiate the end time laid out in the book of Revelation. End time is a fundamentalist Christian belief in a prophecy that the living and the resurrected will one day be delivered from the earth by God, their bodies transformed and protected in heaven as he pours out his wrath on the sinners left behind. That sounds like something out of a novel. Is it true that there are people who really believe that having Israel unified under, having Jerusalem unified under total Israeli control will bring on the end times?
Well, yes, Joy. You know, I come from a fundamentalist evangelical background, and I grew up in the 50s and 60s. I'm 65. And when I was a child, this was the gospel end times version of reality that my parents believed in and many other evangelicals. And, you know, you mentioned Sheldon Adelson and his wife Miriam, who are big donors, and they actually shoveled $83 million into the 2016 Republican coffers. And they did it because they wanted to see this happen. They wanted to see Jerusalem recognized. They wanted to see the two-state policy buried. Adelson has many times said that this would be the destruction of Israel to have two states, essentially turn the Palestinians into people ruled by an apartheid state. But one thing you didn't mention was that another person who's worked very hard for this is John Hagee, who is the minister of a megachurch in Houston. And when this news came out, he said, President Trump, when I spoke to him in the White House about this several weeks ago, he said this very emphatically. He said, other presidents have failed you, John, but I will not disappoint the Christian community. So essentially, when you look at this, it was nothing to do with the Middle East or peace or Palestinian rights or any of the difficulties that have presented themselves to responsible American political leaders and world leaders. This was all about what we're so familiar with Donald Trump and his nepotistic plan, throwing a little red meat to supporters, to big donors. And so whether it's Adelson, whether it's John Hagee representing these folks, this is what it's all about.
Yeah. The Washington Post even reported that Donald Trump didn't appear to even really understand the issues. I talked about it a little bit in the last segment. A little bit from that Washington Post article. While Trump appeared to have made up his mind, he continued to solicit input, two White House officials said, even asking random acquaintances about the Middle East in recent months. Several advisors said he did not seem to have a full understanding of the issue, instead appeared to be focused on seeming pro-Israel in the words of one and, quote, making a deal in the minds of another. I mean, the violence that we've seen on the streets in the West Bank and Gaza, and the clashes, a 6-month-old now in critical condition. The fact that the President of the United States didn't even think about or understand those issues, the humanity of it, it's a little frightening for a lot of people. Frank, can you get how could that be if he is the most popular leader among evangelical Christians, Bible-believing Christians from the far right?
Yeah, you have to understand that the evangelical Christian movement in America latched onto a 19th century concept that was hatched by someone called John Nelson Darby, who said that Jesus could not come back until Israel had been restored as a nation peopled by Jews and Jerusalem was the capital. This is not traditional Christian teaching going back into the ages, even of the Protestant church. You know, this was not a concern of Martin Luther or any Roman Catholic or the Greek Orthodox or anyone else. if you want to update to the present, you know, when I was a kid with my parents in their ministry of L'Abri, we had a number of Christian leaders come by, and one of them had written, Hal Lindsey had written a book called The Late Great Planet Earth, in which he predicted the end times coming in 1980s. He said it's now possible because Israel has been restored. And then others came back and said, no, Jesus can't come back yet because Jerusalem's not restored. Fast forward to the 16 books and 4 films that you had that came out of the Left Behind series, written by a friend of mine, Jerry Jenkins, and his sidekick co-author that wrote it with him. And you've got 60 million copies sold that essentially are total fiction. I'm going to give you an analogy. This is as if the Twilight Zone had been taken as gospel by some religious group, and they were going back through old episodes and basing an entire cultic kind of religion on it. Now, you could laugh at this, or you could dismiss it as craziness. The problem is these folks have direct access to the President of the United States, and he owes them. The white evangelical vote is literally the only people hanging in there with him. Their approval numbers for him are dropping, but not as fast as the rest of the country. So that this decision, I'm sad to say from my point of view, takes a 19th century cultic twisting of Christian tradition teaching. It updates it through these crazy books called the Left Behind series that people have read by the hundreds of millions, 60 million copies sold. You can figure 100 million people more have read them. This is what evangelicals have come to believe. They think it's part of their traditional religion. It is not. And when you look back at this coincidence, that this is all taking place on exactly the date in history in 1917 when the Balfour Declaration was signed, giving Jews the land of Israel, giving 19th century Eastern European Jews the land of Israel in theory, not because of theology, but as a ploy to hit the Turkish Ottoman Empire that were allies with the Germans in the First World War in the head. The tragedy here, Joy, is that every actor in this has been doing it for other reasons. Donald Trump throwing meat to his supporters, getting more money from Adelson and his wife, who are Zionist fanatics, playing games with American evangelicals, who, by the way, say that when Israel is restored and Jesus comes back, all the Jews will be killed. I mean, think about that for a minute in terms of this coalition that is between these two peoples. And then essentially crafting a foreign policy to satisfy the adolescent fantasies of an evangelical white community that has been reared not on Christianity, but on this fantasy series of books called The Left Behind that then cashed in on Hal Lindsey's and other people's books. It boggles the mind. That child who is in critical condition, those people who are dying, the Palestinians who are losing their rights, the poor Israelis, my friends in Israel, I've been there several times. I shot 2 documentary series there. My friends in Israel who will be living in an apartheid state where peace will keep being moved away, are having this done to them by a president who doesn't understand the issues, has never heard of John Nelson Darby and the theology that went with this movement, is clueless about why the evangelicals think this is part of their faith anyway, and is playing games with lowlifes like John Hagee, who's in it for the money and the fundraising, like all these mega pastors on one hand, and Adelson and his wife Miriam, who are fanatics on the other side, who are rejected by most American Jews. Go figure, Joy. Go figure.
And just to sort of put a point on that, Rabbi Rick Jacobs, who represents the largest single group largest single American Jewish group, which is the Union for Reform Judaism. It's the biggest group of all. Put out a statement that said the following: while we share the president's belief that the U.S. Embassy should, at the right time, be moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, we cannot support his decision to begin preparing that move now, absent a comprehensive plan for a peace process. And then one more thing I just want to play for the audience. This is mega pastor Robert Jeffress, and he is part of Donald Trump's Evangelical Advisory Board. This is what he said to Fox News this week.
I believe President Trump is a modern profiling courage for having the guts to do what no other American president has been willing to do. And look, those who are devout Jews and Christians celebrate this decision because they believe what the Bible says, that God gave this country to Israel and made Jerusalem the capital 3,000 years ago.
Your final thoughts, Frank?
All I can say is, you know, quoting John Hagee, who leads this evangelical Zionist movement here in America, which is a weird kind of Zionism because his prophecy says that all the Jews are going to have to be killed before Jesus or when he comes back. He says, I believe at this point in time, Israel is God's stopwatch for everything that happens to every nation, including America, from until now, until the rapture of the church and beyond. Okay. This is lunacy. It is driving American foreign policy. We are in deep, deep trouble.
Frank Schaeffer, we're going to bring you back later in the show. Don't go too far. Thank you very much. So we'll be back with you shortly. And coming up.